All right, hello everyone. Welcome to my channel, Pathology with Dr. T-Rex. So today we'll be talking about signal transduction pathways. Okay, once again, my name is Dr. Tehemba Nyaga. Okay, but you can just call me Dr. T-Rex. All right, so let's begin. All right. So this is the outline we'll be following. We'll start with the introduction. We'll begin with the what is a signal transduction pathway. And after we're done with the introduction, we'll head over to the characteristics of signal transduction pathways. We'll talk about the types of receptors that are involved in these pathways, the transcription factors that are also involved in these pathways, and then we'll, that will be the end of it. We'll conclude, and that will be the end of today's video. So hopefully this will not be a very long video, and I want you to bear with me. It's signal transduction pathways are not we talk about it a lot in medical school, especially in biochemistry, and in pathology it's very important because when you talking about signal transduction pathways is involved in so many types of diseases such as cancers most especially. Okay, because any abnormality involving some of these transduction pathways can lead to um, overactivity of those pathways, which in turn will lead to the uh, the cells proliferating out abnormally and becoming cancers. Okay, signal transduction pathways are also significant for metabolic or genetic disorders. Okay, so but today we're not going to be talking about each or the different kinds of diseases and the different pathways that are involved in those diseases. No, we're just talking about the principles of signal transduction pathways. Okay, so let's begin. All right, so by way of introduction, all the cells in our bodies are exposed to stimuli constantly. Okay, and these stimuli, or you can see them, you can think of the stimuli as signals, induce a specific type of cell to differentiate, proliferate. When I say differentiate, that means it can induce the cell to transform from a immature cell type to a more mature cell type. Okay, so it can, for example, during when a fetus is being formed in the uterus, for example, that's when the baby is developing in the uterus. These pathways are very, very important to, and they help to tell the different cells, the different organs in the fetus's body. It instructs the cells to differentiate or mature into, say, muscle cells, brain cells, heart cells, liver cells, something like that. Okay, so that's some of the functions of this signal transduction pathway. In addition, they can stimulate the cell to proliferate, that is, divide one cell to divide into two cells, or to do other things per se, move, secrete substances, absorb substances, to change its metabolic behavior, so many effects. Okay, and these signals are important because once the cell is cut off from these signals, it's unable to interact with those signals, it dies off. So those signals are important to maintain the cell, to keep the cell alive. Okay, so and as a matter of fact, to keep the whole human body or an organ or a tissue alive. Okay, and what are the types of signals that these cells respond to? They are the growth factors, the nutrients, light, neurotransmitters, microbes, hormones, essentially anything around that is in the environment of the cell can potentially respond to it or potentially has a pathway within that cell designed to respond to any virtually any substance that cell that can be found in the environment of that cell. Okay, but then there's a caveat to that principle, and we'll get to see that as we move along. Okay, so in addition to responding to the chemicals and all sorts of molecules within the environment that are in the environment of around the cell, cells also have a way of communicating with each other. So one cell can send a signal to another cell. Okay, and it can also produce one type of cell can produce a signal that in turn affects the same cell that produced that signal. Okay, so we have different types of signaling pathways between cells, and that's the paracrine, the autocrine, the synaptic, and the endocrine. Okay, so I'll go over this briefly. The paracrine it's a pathway in which the cell that produced the signal also responds to the same signal. So that means the cell produces a signal and the signal acts on the cell that produced it. For the sorry, I'm mixing. That's the autocrine pathway. The autocrine pathway is that the cell that produced the signal gets to respond to the signal it produced. That's autocrine. For the paracrine, that is a cell produces a signal, and that signal travels to nearby cells, not distant cells, cells within the vicinity of the origin of the primary cell that produced the signal. So this one cell A produces a signal and that signal acts on cell B or cell C, and those other types of cells are within the environment of cell A. Okay, for the synaptic pathway, that's the pathway that the brain and the nervous system uses. Okay, you have an impulse, travels along a nerve fiber, gets to the axons, the terminal points of the axons, and then stimulates release um, of neurotransmitters across a small space between the end of one neuron and the other. That space is called a synapse. Okay, so the chemicals that one nerve cell releases to act on the next nerve cell, that's that's called neurotransmitters, and that's the chemicals that are involved in the synaptic pathway. For the endocrine, the cells in endocrine organs as your thyroid, your adrenal glands, the pituitary glands, they produce hormones. Hormones. They are steroid chemicals that are released into the or steroid or protein molecules that are released into the bloodstream, and they travel far away distances to cells, different parts to a distant part of the body to exert action on that cell. Okay, so cells have inbuilt systems called signal transduction pathways, which enable these cells to respond to whatever chemicals or molecules are in their external environment. Okay, so and that is critical to the survival of the cell, like we said earlier. And any derangement or any abnormality in this signal transduction pathway can either lead to the death of the cell, one, or could result into all kinds of diseases. We talk of genetic disorders, most importantly, genetic disorders. We talk of cancers. Okay, but hopefully in future lectures we'll get to look at specific diseases, specific disorders, and the pathways and the molecules within those pathways that are involved in that specific disorder. Okay, so what are the features of signal transduction pathway? Well, first of all, it starts with a signal, and that signal is sort of an information. So if you see, if you could imagine, like let me give an example. We are all humans in a society, in our environments. Okay, we cannot survive on our own. We need information about the environment, and we have to have a way to respond to that. We have to have a way to recognize that information. And yeah, we every day we are exposed to all sorts of information, whether it's from the sound, from the taste, from the sight, the feel, the touch, or so we have to have a way. Our bodies have developed ways for us to respond to each of those signals, or in other words, to respond to the information coming to us from the environment. And if we cannot or if for some reason we are not able to respond to that, then our lives become much more difficult. The same thing that happens to cells. Okay, so what are the mechanisms or some of the structures that the cell has evolved to be able to respond to these signals or to this information that are around it, that are within its environment? Okay, first of all, you have the receptors. The receptors located on the surface of the cell are sort of like antennas that detect that information. And so that antenna detects the information, or the receptor detects that information and activates other molecules within the cell. That is, we can see this as signal transmission. So let's say you have an antenna, you want to pick up a radio station. You, on your radio has to have an antenna to receive that signal from the radio station, and then has to transmit the signal through several transistors and all that stuff within the radio to be able to finally bring it out as some voice or some voice recording from the radio station that you can understand. It's the same thing with the cell. Okay, so the receptor, or in this case the antenna, now activates other molecules within the cell. So it's transmitting the signal into the cell, and eventually that signal will generate a response from the cell, which is the cellular response. That is, in other words, the signal will induce a change in the behavior of the cell, either to 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 respond positively to the signal, or negatively withdraw, or move away from that signal. Okay, so these are the characteristics of signal transduction pathways in general. Okay, and I got this from the Leninger's Principle of Biochemistry, 7th edition. Okay, you can check it out whenever if you have that textbook, you can always check it out. It's very, these things are described very elaborately in that textbook. Okay, so the first characteristic is specificity. And what that simply means is that each receptor binds to a specific signal. Okay, so you don't have, well, let me just, for sake of simplicity, you typically don't have a receptor recognizing so many types of signals, okay, or so many types of stimuli. Typically, you have one receptor recognizes one type of signal, okay, and that the receptor and the signal to which it interacts are complementary to each other. Okay, it's sort of like a lock and key analogy. You have a specific key that opens a specific lock. The same thing, okay? Or you have a certain radio stations will have a certain dial that you can only listen to that radio station if you tune into the right dial. If you have the right dial, the right the well, some people might laugh at the way I'm making, but that's the point. Or so it's the same analogy. A specific key opening a specific lock. Okay, so the next characteristic is amplification. That is when an when the signal transduction pathway becomes active, one enzyme within the pathway activates another enzyme. So it's sort of like a relay. A relay. So one protein molecule passes the signal on to the next, but then it's not just one to one. It's sort of one protein that has been activated goes on to activate, say, two or three more molecules. So in this case, you can, one good analogy is to see, it's to say, think about it this way. If you want to start a rumor, okay, about somebody, I advise you don't do that. If you want to start a rumor about someone, you just all you start by telling your friends, okay, or telling someone something about that the person you want to start a rumor about, and that person will go on to tell, say, three, four other guys, and those three, four other guys will go on to tell more people. So sort of in a way you have, it's the rumor started with you, the singular person, the originator of the rumor, but then it ended up reaching hundreds, in some cases thousands of people. That is the same idea behind amplification of that signal that the receptor receives. So the receptor receives the signal and activates as many molecules as it can in sort of a way so that the signal doesn't die out. Okay, it's trying to increase the amplitude of the signal. Okay, the next thing is modularity. So what this one means is that you have one protein molecule that acts a specific way in one pathway and acts a different way in another pathway. So it could be, so the same protein molecule in one pathway could have a positive effect, positive loop, feedback effect on the pathway. So once it's activated, it goes on to activate more proteins within that pathway. But then the same protein, another pathway will go on to have an inhibitory effect, a negative feedback effect on that pathway. So once it's activated, it goes on to inhibit that a different pathway. And that way, it sort of what the cell is simply doing is that it's, if you notice, once we get to discuss specific pathways in the future, you'll see that the cells have evolved a certain way to utilize the same type of proteins for different pathways. Okay, and these proteins typically or usually have different functions in different pathways. So it's a common theme in molecular biology, right? So the next characteristics is desensitization and adaptation. What that means is as the cell or the transduction signal transduction pathway is continuously exposed to that signal to which it recognizes, eventually that pathway will shut down. It will no longer respond to the signal, or starting with the receptors will no longer have any, they will no longer respond to the signal, no matter how no matter the concentration of the signal molecules that they are exposed to. You know, so it's sort of a negative feedback mechanism to stop the cell from over responding to a specific signal. Okay, and to save its energy resources for another stimuli or for another metabolic process that may be much more useful and life-saving in the future. Okay, so it's to stop the cell from expending all its energy in responding to a single stimuli. Okay, so for integration, what this also means is that one, you could have uh, two signals, two different signals could activate two different pathways, and at the end of the day, those pathways will have the same effect, on the cell. Or they could be, one pathway could could help the next pathway to get to the end result of a response. Okay, so that's what it means by integration. That's sort of uh, yeah, you have, for example, let's talk about say if you look at certain electrolytes, okay, in the human body, say calcium, um, or sodium, potassium. These are different electrolytes, but they have, and they activate different proteins and different receptors respond to those electrolytes. Okay, but when you look at it, say for example in the heart cell, the cardiac muscle, each of these electrolytes and the pathways that respond to them, the end result is that the pathways that respond to this, that utilize these different electrolytes, will end up producing a unified response. That is a muscle, or the contraction of the heart muscle. Okay, so the calcium is required for the actual contraction of the heart muscle, but you also need sodium and potassium to initiate an action potential or an impulse that will initiate that process of heart muscle contraction. So you have two different pathways involving two different things, but at the end of the day, they work together to produce the same, an ultimate response. Okay, that's integration. All right, so we talk of a localized response. That just means that the cell, if you think of the cell like a large city, okay, some and these pathways has different factories within that city. Okay, so the cell will limit uh, the molecules of a certain pathway to a specific subregion or area within that cell. Okay, so it just that, and that's also another useful way of making sure that the not the whole not the, all the organelles of the cell are not utilized, or all the materials and resources of the cell are not utilized in responding to that signal. So it helps to 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 limit this the signal transduction pathway as well as the response of the cell to a specific region. Okay, and that's also another control mechanism that the cell has on those pathways, the signal transduction pathways. All right, so now that we're done with the characteristics, okay, so more on the characteristics. This is just more details on each of those uh, characteristics that that we talked about earlier. So I won't go. I've already explained them in details, so we won't go over it here any longer. We won't spend much time with it here. Okay, so for specificity, we said it's the receptor and the signal response are a complement of one another. Okay, in terms of structure, that's the same thing with the lock and key analysis or analogy rather. Okay, so so in addition to that, another point I would like to mention is a cell will only respond to a signal if it has a receptor for that signal. So, for example, like I mentioned here, epinephrine will affect will have an effect on glycogen metabolism in the liver cell, but no effect on fat cells because fat cells lack receptors for epinephrine. Okay, and some of the factors that contribute to this specificity of signal transduction power are the high affinity of the receptors for the signal. So the receptor is designed in such a way that it can respond to even the smallest amount of the or the presence is designed to respond to the smallest amount of the signal around. Okay, and there's another phenomenon called cooperativity, which means that in addition to responding to that specific signal, it there's marked changes in the activation of that receptor with changes. So a small change in the concentration of the ligand or the molecule or the signal to which the receptor responds also has a large effect on the activation of that receptor. All right. Okay. So the more the signal molecule, the more the receptor is activated. Of course, that doesn't go on. That doesn't happen in infinity. Okay, it gets to a point where the receptor is unable to to activate any more than it should, regardless of the concentration of the signal molecule. All right. Okay, so like I said, the next is the amplification. Next characteristic is amplification. That's the receptor and the signal will go on to activate one enzyme, and that enzyme will go on to activate many more enzymes, and so on and so forth. So we're creating sort of a cascading effect. Okay. So we said here, modularity is where one single protein can have multiple functions within a signaling pathway. That's one pathway could be active. It could have a positive feedback effect in the same in another pathway, or even the same pathway, it could have a negative feedback effect as well. Okay, so for desensitization and adaptation, that's if the signal is present continuously, the receptor no longer becomes is able to respond to that signal. And the reason for this is because if you imagine, say, like, okay, if you ever go into, say, a dance hall, okay, uh, a dance hall, a dance party, where the men are there and imagine the men who are available at that dance party are the receptors that are going to bind to and respond to the females, which are the signals that are available in that dance party. Okay, so if all the men bind to all the women, okay, no matter how many women are available in that dance party, they will not be able to get any more men because all the men have been taken. All the men are occupied with at least one female. Okay, that's the same idea with desensitization, where if the signal is, if you keep increasing the concentration of the signal, eventually the receptors available, receptors or the signal pathways will no longer be able to respond to that signal because they are completely occupied. Okay, so the next one is integration, where you have a system where multiple signals are able to produce a unified response to that meets the appropriate needs of the cell. Okay, so response localization, which is the last characteristic, was the components of the signaling system are confined to a specific subcellular structure. So you could think of this like the same way you have different organs of the body doing different things. The same thing, the cell will have different regions performing different functions as well. Okay, all right. So more on the characteristics. So this is like a synopsis or a summary of everything we've said on the characteristics of signal transduction pathways. So first of all, you have a signal interacts with the receptor. The activated receptor goes on to activate several cellular molecular machineries and or change in behavior of other proteins within the cell. And then this all together will lead to a change in the metabolic activity of that cell. And once that cell has, there's a change in the behavior of that cell, the signal ends. Okay. So another special stuff I would like to talk about here is the adapter proteins. The adapter, they are protein molecules that organize cellular pathways. So they help to link, they form like a conduit between the different molecules of the different molecules or enzymes of a specific pathway. They help to transfer, link one enzyme to the next enzyme and that enzyme to the other enzyme. Okay. Right. So what are the types of receptors? There are four main types. There are many other types, but the four main types are the G protein coupled receptors, receptor with kinase activities, that is receptor tyrosine kinases, receptor serine threonine kinases, and the gated ion channels and the nuclear receptors. Okay, so this is a diagram. I got this from Robin and Cotram, Pathologic Basis of These Diseases. That's the 9th edition. It's a lovely diagram. You can go and check it out. Okay. Right. So we'll just focus on the receptor tyrosine kinases. So first of all, you have your receptor out here located within the cell membrane. Okay. So the growth factor binds to that receptor, leads to activation of the receptor. The receptor now goes on to activate other secondary molecules. That's you have RAS. So the RAS transforms from an inactive form to an active form. And then that active RAS will go on to activate several other kinds of different pathways. And those pathways eventually will culminate in the activation of transcription factors that will go on to initiate the transcription of specific genes to produce gene products that will enable the cell carry out, will enable the cell progress through the cell cycle. All right? Okay, so you don't need to remember all these details. They are not important. Just remember the most important thing you need to remember here is, okay, when you talk of receptor tyrosine kinases, the most important molecule that is associated, so signaling molecule associated with these receptors is RAS. RAS, okay, and this RAS is this receptor, the pathways associated with it are involved in cell growth and proliferation. So those are the most important points you need to remember. That you have receptor tyrosine kinases. The molecules involved in them are RAS, okay, and the pathways that are associated with this receptor are the pathways that induce cell growth and proliferation. And this is important because when we get to several kinds of disorders, metabolic disorders like diabetes, genetic disorders like neurofibromatosis, okay, you will see where specific disorders of, say, is for most importantly RAS, how it alters the pathway and in the end produces the disastrous effects that lead to all those different types of disorders that I just mentioned. That's diabetes and neurofibromatosis and whatever you have. Okay. All right. So for the transcription factors, okay, these are they are proteins molecules that are the endpoints of signal transduction pathways. So at the end of the day, all signal transduction pathways, or let me not say all, but most signal transduction pathways will want to change. The ultimate point of these pathways is to a change in the behavior of the cell. And best way to do that is change to change the expression of certain genes of that cell. So they could either turn on or turn off certain genes. Okay. And that's the job of transcription factors. So at the end of the day, those signal transduction pathways will end up activating transcription factors, and those transcription factors will go on to initiate gene transcription. Okay, so these transcription factors will drive the expression of certain number of genes, not all the cell genome, just specific genes within the cell. Okay, so some genes the expression of some of these genes will stimulate cell growth, while some other genes, expression of some other type of genes, will inhibit cell growth. Okay, for now, you don't need to remember these different types of transcription factors. I'll talk about that in some future video when we discuss specific disorders and the transcription factors involved in those disorders. Okay, all right. So, and what is the structure of these transcription factors? They usually have two domains. That's a DNA binding domain. That's the domain that recognizes specific DNA sequences. And then a protein binding domain that interacts with other molecules from the signal transduction pathway, and as well as other enzymes that it will stimulate to initiate gene transcription. Most importantly, the RNA polymerase enzyme. Okay. So that's about it. So in conclusion, go over the important facts we talked about. So cells must interact with the environment and respond appropriately to ensure their survival. And the mechanisms that allow them to do this are intricate biochemical mechanisms, and those mechanisms respond to different stimuli and behave accordingly. And these mechanisms are known as signal transduction pathways. Okay, and they are different. These pathways are different. There are many types of signal transduction pathways, and they recognize different types of signals. However, they have many features in common. Okay, and I said, why is this all important? Because many diseases nowadays, okay, when we talk of molecular medicine, or tailored medicines, it's the knowledge of these pathways that allows us to design specific drugs to treat specific disorders. Especially when you're talking about cancers and metabolic or genetic disorders. These pathways are crucial to understanding the pathogenesis or the abnormalities underlying those disorders. Very, very crucial. Okay, so this will be highlighted when we begin to discuss those specific disease processes. All right. Okay, so I think that's it. Thank you very much, and hopefully I'll see you again in the next video. All right. Thank you, and have a lovely day.